Hi everyone. So this week we are going to start talking about some of the basic statistical tools that we're going to use to give context to our data. So as we've already touched on briefly in class, the really important thing that we want to be able to do with data is to give it context, because context is how we derive and communicate meaning about data. And in order to do that, some of the basic statistical tools that we need are what we call measures of spread and central tendency. And we already touched on these briefly. Measures of central tendency are mean and median. Our measures of spread are going to be the standard deviation, as well as something called the upper and lower bounds and the IQR. Those last couple actually apply in cases where the median is the more appropriate measure of central tendency. In any case, we're going to actually go through the mechanics of how we identify, or rather calculate these various measures and then use them in a journalistic context. To do that, of course, we need to have some data to work with. And so for the purposes of this exercise, we are going to use city bike data. City bike data is readily available, as you can see. It's provided in a couple of nice formats. The one we're going to be working with for the next couple of weeks is a CSV-based file. So this is sort of historical data looking at, as we can infer from the file names, in this case, monthly data. So the data is released monthly with probably some bit of a delay. So my guess is that when we go down to look for the most recent data, 2017, there we go. Yeah, so we're going to see September is the most recently available data, which is fine. I'm just going to go ahead and download this and throw it on the desktop. Now, one thing that I want to point out here is there's actually a second kind of set of city bike trip data. If we were to do some sleuthing, we would discover that that is actually city bike data about Jersey City. City bike is now available in Jersey City, New Jersey. But when I first encountered this a few weeks ago, I actually didn't know. I couldn't tell. It wasn't obvious to me, right, just from the file name, what the difference was between these two data sets. Now, one clue actually lies in the file size, right? So if I hadn't guessed that JC was Jersey City, the one thing that I do know about it right off the bat is that it's a much smaller file than the traditional city bike data. And in fact, what I ended up doing was looking at some of the locations, the latitudes and longitudes of the stations, and determining that they were in fact in Jersey City, which again correlated with my hypothesis that this was not the regular city bike data. The point of that is mostly just to say that if you look at the very sparse amount of data that we're given here, just a file name, that in almost every case where we're handling structured data, we have to do additional reporting in order to understand actually what those files contain. In the case of city bike data, they're really helpful. They actually give us a meaningful description of not just the columns that we're going to find in this structured data, but they also give us things like units, which is really helpful. And distinguishing characteristics, right? Customers, a 24-hour or 3-day pass user, subscribers, an annual member, gender, 0 unknown, 1 male, 2 female, year of birth, things like that. So very often, however, when we get when we get structured data, that information is not going to be readily available. And we're going to have to do reporting in order to find out. So the first thing that I'm going to do, I am using a PC, so your process is going to look a little bit different. I'm going to have to manually extract this. And once I have that, the next thing I'm going to do actually is I am going to open this with Notepad. Now, if you're on a Mac, which most of you will be, you're going to open this in TextEdit instead of Notepad, but they do equivalent things on the different operating systems. And the reason why I'm doing this in Notepad is because I know that working with Notepad isn't going to crash my computer. Okay, so if we look at the file size is pretty substantial. It's over 300 megabytes right here. This is the kind of thing that if I just double-clicked it so that it opened in Excel, might very well stall out my computer. There are a lot of rows of data here. And one of the big things that we're going to be focusing on during this course is how do we deal with progressively larger and messier sets of data, because very often that's a big part of dealing with data, is kind of cleaning it up. Okay, so what I can see now handily is the fact that these, the columns, right, I see this is a CSV separated by commas, that these are separated by commas and that they seem to line up with the promised columns from the metadata provided on the City Bike web page. So I see trip duration, start time, stop time, start ID, et cetera, latitude, longitude. And bike ID, which is kind of interesting. You can see where a particular bike went. User type, birth year, gender, all of the things that we were promised, okay? So this is great, but in order to deal with it, in the background here, what I'm first going to do is a little bit of magic so that I'm dealing with a slightly smaller data set. And then I'm going to demonstrate the kinds of analyses that we would do and how we would do them in Microsoft Excel, because particularly for our measures of spread and central tendency, that's going to probably be, at the outset, the tool that we want to use first. So here we go. Okay, so in the background, I have done a little bit of manipulation. This isn't really magic, as I said, because it's not, and because you're going to learn how to do it yourselves next week. But for the meantime, I have arbitrarily decided to take the first 10,000 rows of data, and now I am going to open that in Microsoft Excel. So my double clicking is going to open this in Excel, and you can see that my computer is able to handle this pretty easily. Depending on the machine you're on, it might be more or less quick, but this is a good place to introduce some of the basics of Excel. So for those of you who are familiar, just hang on tight. For those of you who aren't, here's a little bit of an intro. So one thing that we see right away is that there is a column that is full of hashtags, hash signs, or pound signs. That's just Microsoft Excel's way of telling you that there's too much data for it to display in the width of the column. So we can actually solve that quite quickly just by resizing the column so we can get a slightly better idea of what the content is there. And you'll notice as I scroll across here that it's showing me the value that's contained in that data in this function bar. Now the function bar is going to be a place where we do a fair amount of work. It's going to help us see the difference between a calculation that's being executed and the resulting value. That'll make a little bit more sense when we start doing functions in just a second. But basically, again, I can kind of, the sort of typical way that we interact with Excel is through kind of scrolling down. I can scroll all the way down to my very last row here, which I will point out is labeled 10,001, and that is, of course, because I have a header row in my data. And that header row means that understanding the count in my data set is always going to be offset by 1 as long as I have that header row. So keep that in the back of your head because it's going to be meaningful in just a moment. Now, in order to make any kinds of, so what we're going to be looking at here is we're going to be interpreting, we're going to be looking for measures of spread and central tendency along the trip duration parameter, right? And why is this? This is how long people's rides are. And so maybe there's a pattern to that. Maybe there's not. We'll talk a little bit more detail in class about how we derive shapes, the shapes of the data from this. But for now, we're just going to kind of do the math and then we'll talk about the implications. So the first thing that I want to do, however, is that I want to have some uniformity. I do want to organize my data in some way. And in this case, it makes the most sense for me to organize it by the start station ID, right? I want to compare the duration of different trips taken from the same place, right? Leaving from the same location. Because otherwise, I might be comparing things that are very remote to things that are very close to others, and it would be hard to say anything substantive about that. Remember that the whole objective of this is to be able to contextualize and say something meaningful about this data. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to highlight all of my rows here, and just to clarify, the way that I did this, there's a few different ways to do this. This is my preferred way, which is that I like to highlight the actual letter. Now, again, it's going to look a little bit different for you all because you're on Macs probably. But basically, I highlight this, and then under the data view, I can choose sort. And when I choose sort, it's going to say sort by, and I'm going to choose trip duration. So because I have that header row, it's going to actually give me the name of the header, right? Instead of column A, column B, column C, it'll say trip duration. Sorting on values, smallest to largest. So all this is going to do, I actually don't want to sort on trip duration. That was wrong. I'm going to start on start station ID. And I can say smallest to largest because who cares? And you can see right away that the lowest start station ID in this is start station 72. And I'm just going to scroll down to see how many I have. And I have about 20 entries, which is fine. Again, this is for the purposes of the exercise. All I'm doing is I'm just getting a sample that I can work with. Now, again, for the purposes of this exercise, one of the first things that I'm going to do is I am going to select all those rows. And so again, the way that I did that, this is another way that I like to do selection. So if I'm selecting, if I put my cursor in where the number is, the labeling of the number of the row, I can actually also just scroll down to the last row that contains the value I'm interested in. And if I press the Shift key and then click, it'll automatically select everything in between. You can also hold down Shift while you use the arrow keys. There's a bunch of different ways to do it. Each of you will have your preference. That's something to kind of play around with a little bit. So now I'm going to go ahead and copy this. I'm just going to do an Apple C. And if you see down here, I'm going to say plus, and I'm going to do an Apple V to paste it. Okay. Now this is important because as much as possible, I want to I always want to retain a reference to my original data set. We're always going to end up making edits to our data as we do analyses, or most of the time we're going to end up making edits to our data. But it's good to keep a frame of reference just for where it came from, right? This is the history. And one piece that I haven't been doing here that of course you all are going to need to do is the documentation file. So for me, that would just be a Notepad or a WordPad document where I would just literally start by writing down where my data came from. So I would probably start it with, download data from, and I would actually paste in the URL, and then I would say something like browse in Notepad, open in Microsoft Excel. Right? And so on and so forth. But this is something that I want to be doing in real time. So I want to be doing right alongside the steps that I'm executing. So it's important now, I'm going to relabel this sheet 1, and I'm just going to call this, station 72 because that's the station ID that I have copied here. And I'm now going to do a file, and I'm going to do a save as, okay? And the reason why I'm doing a save as here is because a CSV, again, is just a text file, and it cannot save multiple sheets, and it cannot save formatting, and it cannot save formulas. And we are going to want to save all of those things. So all I have to do is go up here to Microsoft, to Excel Workbook, and that will take care of that. So now I have my original data in one tab, I have my edited data in a second tab, and I can continue to do whatever work on this that I need to. The next step that I'm going to do is I am going to start looking at my measures of central tendency, right? And happily, these are pretty straightforward to do. So the first thing that I'm going to do just to kind of get ahead of it here is I'm going to sort once again. So I'm already on the data tab, I'm going to click sort, and I'm going to say sort by trip duration, okay? So in this case, in order to find the median, hopefully you'll remember from your reading, you have to first sort the values that you're finding the median of. So I'm going to say sort smallest to largest, and I can see here that my smallest is 177, my largest is 2577. Okay, and from here I can find both the mean and the median. Now, the mean is pretty easy. I'm going to label this here. Okay, and in this cell is where I'm going to actually calculate the mean. Now, when I want to do some math in Excel, okay, anytime I want it to use a formula, I always signal that by beginning with an equals sign. Okay, and in this case, all I have to do is say sum, okay, which is the name of the formula, and then I give it the ingredients that I want it to do that formula on. In this case, the ingredients, as I like to call them, also called arguments, are just the trip duration cells, and I can select them just as you saw, actually with my mouse. Okay, and then I have to close the round parentheses. So notice that I wrote equals sum, and then I opened a left round parentheses, and now I've selected all my cells, and I do have to come up here and close it. And when I hit enter, it's going to give me the sum. Okay, now notice that I see the formula. Oops, I see the formula in the function bar, but I see the result in the cell. Now, of course, the mean is add them all up and divide by the number. And since I have 20 rows, I'm going to divide by 20. And there I have my mean. The next thing we're going to work on is the median. The median is pretty simple. We basically just have to find the midpoint of the data set. However, we have an even number of rows here. So when we come back, we're going to talk about how to deal with finding the median when you have an even number of rows. See you in a moment.